Hello, we are in Chapter 3, Section 4, beginning on page 76, Southern Colonies. American Diary. Anthony Johnson was one of the first Africans in colonial Virginia. Arriving in 1621, Johnson worked on a tobacco plantation along the James River. He and his wife Mary eventually bought their way out of bondage. They acquired their own land and raised livestock. After Johnson's death, however, a Virginia court ruled that because he was an African and by consequence an alien or foreigner, close quote, the land rightly belonged to the British Crown. Quoted in Africans in America. Maryland and Virginia, main idea. While Maryland grew and dealt with Protestant Catholic conflicts, Virginia settlers continued to push westward. History in you. Can you build a house whenever you want? Read about how Virginia settlers responded to restrictions placed on where they could live. Former enslaved Africans such as Anthony Johnson rarely owned land in colonial America. White males controlled most property, especially plantations, which became important to the economic growth of the southern colonies. As the number of plantations grew, the need for workers increased. Not all people came to work in the colonies of their own free will. English criminals and prisoners of war were shipped to the colonies. They could earn their release by working for a period of time, usually 7 years. African rulers sold their prisoners of war to European slave traders who took the enslaved prisoners in the colonies. Many people also came to the colonies as indentured servants. To pay for their passage to America, they agreed to work without pay for a certain length of time, establishing Maryland. Maryland arose from the dream of Sir George Calvert, Lord Baltimore. Calvert wanted a safe place for his few Catholics who were being persecuted in England. King Charles I gave Calvert a proprietary colony north of Virginia. However, Calvert died before receiving the grant. His son Cecilius inherited the colony and named it Maryland. Cecilius sent 2 of his brothers to run the colony. They reached America in 1634. Cecilius gave large estates or pieces of land to English aristocrats. He also granted land to other settlers. As the number of plantations grew and more workers were needed, the colony imported indentured servants and enslaved Africans. For years, the Calvert and Penn families argued over the boundary between Maryland and Pennsylvania. In the 1760s, they hired Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon to map the boundary and lay a line of stones bearing from Penn and Calvert crests, the Mason-Dixon line. Another conflict was harder to resolve. The Calverts had welcomed Protestants as well as Catholics in Maryland. Protestant settlers outnumbered Catholics. To protect the Catholics, the Act of Toleration was passed in 1649. The act granted Protestants and Catholics the right to worship freely. However, tensions continued. In 1692, the Protestant-controlled Assembly made the Anglican Church the official church in Maryland. Catholics then faced the same restrictions as they had in England. Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia. While other colonies were being founded, Virginia continued to grow. Settlers moved west and settled Native American lands. In the 1640s, to avoid conflicts, Virginia Governor William Berkeley made a pledge to Native Americans. In exchange for a large piece of land, he agreed to keep settlers from pushing farther into their country. Nathaniel Bacon. A young planter in western Virginia opposed the colonial government because it was dominated or controlled by Easterners. Many Westerners also resented Berkeley's pledge to stay out of Native American territory. Some settled in the forbidden areas. They then blamed the government for not protecting them. In 1676, Bacon led attacks on Native American villages. His army also marched to Jamestown and drove Berkeley into exile. Only Bacon's sudden death kept him from governing Virginia. England then recalled Berkeley and sent troops to restore order. Bacon's rebellion showed that settlers would not be limited to the coast. The colonial government formed a militia to control Native Americans and opened up more land for settlement. Reading check. Analyzing. Why did Bacon oppose the colonial government? The Carolinas and Georgia. Main idea. The Carolinas and Georgia developed into major southern colonies. History in you. Do you believe that people who are in debt should be given a fresh start in life? Read to learn the reasons why Georgia was created. In 1663, King Charles II created a proprietary colony south of Virginia called Carolina, Latin for Charles Land. The king gave the colony to 8 nobles who had helped him regain his throne. The proprietors set up estates and sold or rented land to settlers brought from England. John Locke, an English philosopher, wrote a constitution or plan of government for the colony that governed topics such as land divisions and social ranking. Concerned with principles and rights, Locke argued that, quote, every man has a property in his own person. The labor of his body and the works of his hands are properly his, close quote. Carolina, however, did not develop as planned. It split into northern and southern Carolina, creating two colonies. Northern and southern Carolina. Farmers from inland Virginia settled northern Carolina. They grew tobacco and sold timber and tar. The northern Carolina coast lacked a good harbor, so farmers used Virginia's ports to conduct their trade. Southern Carolina, however, prospered from fertile farmland and the harbor of Charlestown, later Charleston. Settlements there spread, and trade in deerskin, lumber, and beef thrived. Two crops came to the dominant Carolina agriculture. In the 1680s, planters discovered that rice grew well in the wet coastal lowlands. Growing rice acquired much labor, so the demand for slave labor rose. Another important crop, indigo, was developed in the 1740s by a young Englishwoman named Eliza Lucas. Indigo, a blue flowering plant, was used to dye textiles. By the early 1700s, Carolina settlers wanted political power. In 1719, settlers in southern Carolina seized control from its proprietors. In 1729, Carolina became two royal colonies, Northern Carolina and South Carolina. Georgia. Georgia, founded in 1733, was the last British colony set up in America. James Oglethorpe received a charter for a colony where debtors and poor people could make a fresh start. In Britain, debtors, those who were not able to repay debts, were imprisoned. British officials also had hoped that Georgia, located north of Spanish Florida, would protect the other colonies from Britain's enemy, Spain. Oglethorpe and the first group of settlers built the forts and towns of Savannah as a barrier against Spanish expansion. Georgia did not develop as Oglethorpe planned. Few debtors settled there. Instead, hundreds of poor people came from Britain. Religious refugees from Central Europe and a small group of Jews also arrived. Many settlers complained about Oglethorpe's rules, especially the limits on landholding and the bans on slave labor and rum. A frustrated Oglethorpe finally agreed to their demands. Disappointed with the colony's slow growth, he gave up and turned Georgia back over to the king in 1751. By that time, the British had been in eastern North America for almost 150 years. They had lined the Atlantic coast with colonies. The French and Spanish in North America. Main idea. The French and Spanish expanded their lands in North America. History and you. What might it be like to explore a large unknown river that runs for thousands of miles? Read to learn about the French explorers who traveled along the Mississippi River. The British were not the only Europeans colonizing North America. Elsewhere in the continent, the Spanish and the French built settlements of their own. The French founded Quebec in 1608. At first, they had little interest in large-scale settlement in North America. They were mainly concerned with fishing and trapping animals for their fur. French trappers and missionaries went far into the interior of North America. Forts and trading posts were built to protect their profitable trade. In 1663, New France became a royal colony. King Louis XIV limited the privileges of the fur companies. He appointed a royal governor who supported these explorations down the Mississippi River. In the 1670s, two Frenchmen, a fur trader, Louis Joliet, and a priest, Jacques Marquette, explored the Mississippi River by canoe. Joliet and Marquette hoped to find gold, silver, or other precious metals. They were also looking for a water passage to the Pacific Ocean. When they realized that the Mississippi flowed south into the Gulf of Mexico rather than west into the Pacific, they turned around and headed back upriver. A few years later, René Robert Cavelier Sieur de La Salle, pardon me if you're French and watching this, wasn't pronounced the best, La Salle, followed the Mississippi River all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. La Salle claimed the region for France, calling it Louisiana in honor of King Louis XIV. In 1718, the French governor founded the port of New Orleans. Later, French explorers and missionaries traveled west of the Rocky Mountains and southwest to the Rio Grande. Growth of New France. French settlement in North America advanced slowly. New France was made up of estates along the St. Lawrence River. Estate holders received land in return for bringing settlers. Known as tenant farmers, the settlers paid their lord an annual rent and worked for him for a fixed number of days each year. The French had better relations with the Native Americans than did other Europeans. French trappers and missionaries traveled deep into Indian lands. They lived among the Native American peoples, learned their languages, and respected their ways. Although the missionaries had come to convert Native Americans to Catholicism, they did not try to change their customs. Most importantly, the French colony grew so slowly that Native Americans were not pushed off their lands. Spanish interests. In the early 1600s, England, France, and the Netherlands began colonizing North America. The Spanish, however, still controlled most of Mexico, the Caribbean, and Central and South America. They also expanded into the western and southern parts of the present-day United States. Spain wanted to keep the other European powers from threatening its empire in America. To protect their claims, the Spanish sent soldiers, missionaries, and settlers north into present-day New Mexico. In 1609 or 1610, the Spanish founded Santa Fe. They also went to what is now Arizona in the late 1600s. When France claimed land around the Mississippi River, the Spanish moved into what is now Texas. Spain wanted to control the area between the French territory and Mexico. In the early 1700s, Spain built San Antonio and other military posts in Texas. Spanish priests built a string of missions along the Pacific coasts. Missions are religious settlements established to convert people to a faith. The missions helped the Spanish claim California. The Spanish did more than convert local Native Americans to Christianity. Spanish missionaries and soldiers also brought them to the missions, often by force, to labor in fields and workshops. In 1769, Junipero Serra, a Franciscan monk, founded a mission at San Diego. Over the next 15 years, Father Serra set up other missions in California along a route called El Camino Real, the Royal Highway. These missions later became cities such as Los Angeles and Monterey. Serra traveled on foot to supervise the missions. Serra also supported Native Americans' rights by working to prevent Spanish soldiers from mistreating them. European conflicts. Rivalries between European nations carried over into the Americas. In North America, France and Britain were expanding their settlements. Both nations fought several wars in the early 1700s. When the two countries warred in Europe, fighting often erupted between their colonies in North America. In the late 1700s, wars in Europe would greatly shape events in America. Reading check, explaining, why did Spain establish missions in California? Section 4 review. Use each of these terms in a sentence that will help explain its meaning. Indentured servant, estate, constitution, debtor, tenant farmer, mission. Main ideas. 2. Describing. How did Maryland deal with tensions between Protestant and Catholic settlers? 3. Identifying. Who was John Locke and what did he do for Carolina? Number 4. Explaining. Why were the French slow to settle in North America? Critical thinking. 5. Analyzing. Why did demand for enslaved workers increase as the southern colonies grew? 6. Determining cause and effect. Use a diagram like the one below to describe the causes and effects of Bacon's rebellion. 7. Descriptive writing. Suppose you are a member of La Salle's expedition. Write an entry into your journal that describes your experiences along the Mississippi River for one day. Include things that you experienced through each of your 5 senses: sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell. Answer the essential question. Number 8. How and why did the southern colonies grow? Okay, that takes care of Chapter 3, Section 4. Coakley out.